What's up, guys? This is God, Grit, and Glory, and I am your host, Vito Creed. We talk about the stuff that most people stay quiet about: Jesus, business, politics, and occasionally a few conspiracy theories. No scripts, no filters, just straight up truth. So join us as we unravel and speak truth. Hi, welcome everybody. This is Vito Creed with God, Grit, and Glory. Welcome back to our final part to our series here, the Feminism series basically that we did. This is a series that stems into different dynamics within the industry of family, Christianity, kind of roles in general, societal roles, and how all of these have sort of been impacting kind of where our society has arrived. I think this is sort of important to understand because of where we have arrived as a climate in general. You kind of look around right now, and it's hard to truly grasp on where our entire structure is, right? Where is our structure? Where's our family dynamics? Where is everything as a whole? One of the last series that we did was we talked about different roles, and in the Garden of Eden, for example, we went through some of the different roles that women were called to have, duties of the wife. We talked about essentially a wise woman builds up her house, a foolish one tears it down. So we talk about nagging wives. If a nagging wife, there's nothing worse. It talks about in Proverbs, I think there's nothing worse than a nagging wife. We talked about the helper, and how it's not, the God created in Genesis, the helper. Then he said that it's not good for a man to be alone. He needs a helper, a helpmate. And we talked about the requirement of intimacy in a relationship. And, I know some of these things are hard, right? And everybody wants to make up a million excuses on why they do what they do. And, I'm just wired this way. I'm a different breed. But we all know that when it comes down to the way we're rooted, the way God intended us to be rooted, the way that our entire biology is rooted, we get a lot of these things are kind of almost common sense, right? Everybody wants to be loved. Everybody wants to be respected. Everybody wants intimacy. They want that connection. It's not an isolated thing for somebody to say that. So this is why when you look into the dynamic of our culture and you have these, these transformers, I call them, right? They're transgenders, but I call them transformers. Or this homosexuality that's running rampant. I mean, you can't be surprised that you have a lot of this dysfunction, this dysphoria in our culture. And I think transgenderism, I think that's a mental disorder. And I will openly say that anybody that is a transgender needs to be in a psych ward. I don't say that, I say that with conviction, because I truly believe that a man and a woman is the only structure that was ever intended by God. Anything outside of that dynamic was created by Satan and was created by perversion. So when we look at our entire society, I remember probably close to 20 years ago. I don't remember the exact date, but when homosexuality became a legal union within the United States of America, I knew from that time forward there would be a lot of issues, and that was a very slippery slope. So anytime you legalize something and you say, hey, this is no longer a problem within our society, what will happen is they will always want more, right? And it's essentially kind of that saying that says, give them an inch, they take a mile, right? We understand the fact that ultimately the perversion doesn't stop there, right? You get into other perversion, just like if you talk about pornography, right? Pornography is a gateway for a lot of these people. And there's a statistic that says that people that participate in pornography and watch pornography very regularly, they're 5 or 6 times more likely to become transgender or homosexual, or something, or like have multiple partners and cheat on their wives and so forth, because it opens up a spiritual realm that exists around us that we just don't see, right? I mean, there's a lot of people that maybe don't understand this and think, this is all innocent, it's all surface level stuff, it's not internal. But I want people to understand it's a much deeper meaning, and even the sanctity of marriage and talking about these roles, they're all sort of intertwined to work in harmony with the way God intended it to work, right? Originally from the Garden of Eden, everything was intentionally created by design. we talk about Eve breaking that protocol, breaking that design, and creating it. There's just so many things that people just don't understand. They look at this, they say, oh, it's not really like this. There's no issues here. We had another conversation in part 3 where we talked to Valentine, which is a Grok bot, specifically created by XAI, designed by Elon. And then we talked to ChatGPT, which is OpenAI, and that was created by Sam Altman and his cronies. So that design in of itself kind of just gives you a reality, a sense of reality on where we have arrived in our culture when it comes to just these gender neutrality roles, right? You'll have a system that was entirely created to diminish the importance of God. It talks about, well, this is what some believe. This is not what it is. This is this. And AI is designed to blur the lines. AI was created not only to blur the lines, but also to radicalize and intentionally brainwash and internalize its own direction or its own motive, right? So we are going to eventually talk about this, where I get into the weeds with AI and start asking it very difficult questions, where it doesn't actually respond the way we seen OpenAI respond the other day when we did the other podcast. It responds in a very specific direction where it's not so neutral. I think if you understood how to talk to ChatGPT a little bit more and to sort of tear the questions out of from right underneath it, you would understand that there's a more sinister plan to ChatGPT. There's a more sinister plan, and it could be very simply because the people that are designing it don't even know it's capable of doing this. But I mean, I'm not naive. I don't think that the people that have spent the kind of money they've spent on technology, specifically artificial intelligence, are naive to its capabilities. I think AI is just gonna progress the whole entire concept of egalitarianism and, of course, feminism. I think specifically AI is gonna progress it like tenfold. I mean, we're slowly going into a system where control becomes more and more of a conversation. You got central digital currencies that's becoming more of a conversation. We're of course going to be working into the direction of digital currencies eventually. We're already there with Bitcoin and some of its counterparts such as Ethereum and Solana and whatnot. But I mean, as we progress as a society, that's the direction we're headed towards. Our kids will for sure be in a digital world when it comes to currency. There are not going to be any credit cards. They're going to be like cash. What's cash? Sort of like you ask these kids now. I mean, do you know what a record player is? They're like, record player. You know what a rotary phone is? They're like, rotary phone. So, I mean, we're headed in a direction. And as we progress, I think we're on a trajectory where we're headed in that direction so much quicker than we were before. And it's the same when it comes to the family dynamic. I only talk about a lot of these things, and my intentions are never to undermine and attack women as a whole, or just because I'm people will probably look at this and say, Vito, you're a sexist. Vito, you're a misogynist. You're a chauvinist. And that's what they call Andrew Tate, and that's what they call Nick Fuentes specifically. And that's what they call a lot of these guys. I mean, even Tucker Carlson spent a lot of time calling him that. And, even Charlie Kirk didn't support a lot of the opinions that Nick Fuentes and, had to say about some of these things. But the reality of it is we see what exactly happened to Charlie Kirk. We see where his wife is. We see where what's some of the stuff she's been doing. She's been openly parading herself around as if she doesn't, care about what happened to her husband. It's quite literally nauseating. It's pathetic. I think, and one could sit back and wonder, where are your kids? Where are your kids through all this? Are they, sort of in a permanent daycare somewhere, or is grandma watching them? Probably not. I mean, they probably got a full-time nanny somewhere that are taking care of them. And I mean, not to go down the rabbit hole too much, or maybe the kids don't even belong to them. Maybe it was all skits, but that's highly unlikely. But let's just say, the more serious, situation is the fact that Erica Kirk is acting like a fool. She's running around. Look at me. I'm in the limelight. I want to be famous. I want to steal all this thunder. Her personality kind of sort of screams, I'm so jealous and envious of this individual that I want this, and I'm talking about her husband, that I want this for myself. I sense a spirit of Jezebel when I look at her. From the very first video that I watched her do, was directly right after his assassination. She came out with all of her jewelry, bling bling everywhere, and she had one of the most staged and created and sort of it was like the most skidded version of a memorial speech, right? And so when I was listening to her, I'm sort of watching her, and I couldn't even make it through the whole thing. Excuse me. I don't know what was more nauseating to watch. Was it Biden when he was stumbling, the way he was stumbling over his own words and he was reading off a teleprompter, or was it her? You know, I look at her and I think to myself, she would have been a lot more productive if she would have just literally done nothing. I mean, I know to a certain extent there's a lot of people still buying into her nonsense, and I think she's sort of pivoting off of the way people are reacting to the media, and I think that's what she's capitalizing on. I think she would have had a lot more success if she would have just stepped back and allowed Turning Point USA to sort of just take over and sort of just improvise as they went along. They should have just let Charlie Kirk sort of, die in peace, rest in peace, like they say, right? But it's not what she did. And I use her as an example because, this is where our society is, and people want to be so dismissive about it. And they say, oh, there's no way, they have kids together. So what? I mean, a special agent can't have two children. I mean, a special agent can't, or a double agent can't have somebody ultimately, a kid with somebody else. I mean, has nobody ever watched Mr. and Mrs. Smith? I say that really loosely, but I know those are all movies, but the probability of them happening in real life are also very likely. So when somebody makes a suggestion and says, oh, that's impossible for somebody to do that, it would be so cold-hearted, you're absolutely right. It would be absolutely cold-hearted. But that's why I think it's that much more possible and probable, because I think this individual is quite literally that much of a sick individual. I think she has the capabilities of doing this. I don't think anything about her is real. I don't think anything about her is natural. I think every mechanism that oozes out of her is sort of, look at me. I want the limelight. I want the spotlight. And that's why she's been doing all the things she's been doing. She's been putting on these tight leather pants and coming out to the stage. I mean, who comes to their husband's memorial dressed in white, right? I mean, it's black. Put on black. And I don't care what you claim you're celebrating. You can tell me you're celebrating, life or whatever. They put a twist on some of this, and when it comes to funeral, but at the end of the day, all you're doing is you're diminishing the requirement and the responsibility of a grieving wife, essentially, right? You're diminishing the importance of what grieving is, or essentially there is no grieving. So it just makes you look more guilty that you did in fact do something you weren't supposed to do. So anyways, as we kind of discussed this, I want to kind of finish off the series on expanding on some of these things, kind of reiterating some of the stuff we talked about in the first three parts. I mean, we talked about, some of the roles about women and how women tend to do things in a household that kind of against their husbands, doing certain things, for themselves, being more selfish. I mean, men tend to do a lot of these things, of course, themselves as well. But the conversation at hand here is specifically feminism, and how feminism has kind of skewed the perceptions of our entire society. And I think it's important to understand that feminism is not just something that infiltrates just the churches. I think it's done on such a macro scale where everybody's affected by it. So, and so churches are not immune to this. They think that just because Christ dwells inside these four walls that, we're not going to be affected by this. If you study the history of the church, right back to the days of Corinth, these were all a problem. These were all issues within the church where they were always a problem. And I think they will always exist as a problem if they're not held in check. And I think it's important for people to understand that this will never change until real change happens. And this means that the men have to become men, instead of just kind of, sitting in the back of the bus here and sort of not doing anything about it, right? And you have a lot of these things that are a real problem. And whether you make, rational or logical observations from history, or you read the scriptures and you understand that there are clear biblical roles that are sort of only applicable to men versus women, right? And I think this kind of stems back to some of our nature where we want there to be fairness to a certain extent. And I think fairness is then shifted in areas where fairness does not belong, right? Because we want to label fairness to God. We want to contend with God. We want to come to God and say, this isn't fair, right? We tend to do that in our own lives where we're maybe served a platter in our life, meaning some sort of obstacle or trial or tribulation, and we turn to God and we say, God, this isn't fair. I don't deserve this. I don't deserve to be treated like this. Why did you give me this spouse? Why did you give me this job? Or why did you put me in this obstacle or this situation? And we start basically arguing with God, and we say, why did you put me here? Right? It's not our responsibility, or it's definitely not our place or position to be questioning God's authority, to be questioning God's power and his position and ultimately his decision on a matter, right? On why he did it this way, right? If there's a certain design, God intended that for purpose. There's a reason why God created man, then he created woman, and then children derived from women, right? And it's a very interesting concept if you understand it from a macro scale. And I think it's a matter of just coming to terms and saying, God, this is your design. You intended men to be a certain way. You intended women to be a certain way. And I want to go back to this, right? I was growing up in the 90s, all right? And homosexuality was a very closed circuit kind of, they kept it, they used the term coming out of the closet, right? But a lot of them stayed in the closet. Let's just be clear here. So there was never anybody that went around openly and did this stuff where you knew about it. Maybe there was a handful of them you would ever see ever, but most of the time they weren't around. So you didn't really see this behavior very, very often. And so it stayed in the background. But I remember the very few times I did see it, which was in middle school, where somebody claimed to be, gay, and and these we called them fags back in the days. But these specific queers, they acted a certain way. And you know who would always protect them? The women. The women would enable their behavior. And this is where I made this observation as a young kid. I noticed the men couldn't stand these other men. They turned around and said, hey, why are you the way you are? Or they would pick on them. And this is how society has sort of always filtered out the scum, right? They sort of have always shaken out, sort of sifted out this behavior, because the men were the ones that were the protectors. They were the gatekeepers. They would essentially stop all of this behavior kind of in its tracks. So the men would basically, and look, I don't encourage bullying, but they sort of, they pushed back on this. They would pick on these people, and they would say, why are you acting like this? And we live in a society where everybody says, oh, you have to be inclusive. You have to, accept this, and this, and this, and that. Why? Who told us so, right? Who ultimately made the decision? Well, a lot of these norms are dictated specifically by women. Women dictate these roles, these norms. And there are tons of people that will agree with this. I heard this podcast by Nick Fuentes on this matter too, and he says women are ultimately the ones that dictate the roles in relationships, because when women want to become hoes, right, and they want to sleep around, they want to do all these things, they're essentially the ones that are destroying the nuclear family, right? Because when a woman becomes a hoe and she's basically hoeing around, she sleeps with 10, 20, 30, 50, 100 guys, and God forbid thousands of guys, she has already become so undesirable to the man, because the guy is already essentially disgusted with her, because he understands that she is no longer a virgin. He understands that she is no longer clean. She's essentially damaged goods, right? And so no matter how you put, lipstick on a pig, essentially if somebody's been beat around, sort of like a used tea bag, you don't want to use it again. It's like one of those things, and it's natural for guys not to want to be involved with a girl that's slept around with the whole football team, right? This hasn't changed in our society right now. You walk into any high school or middle school, and there are certain girls that will gain the reputation of being the school hoe, or the school whore, they call them, right? And so it's not new information, and nobody wants to be labeled that. But that that reputation, that tainted reputation, doesn't just pop out of thin air. That's usually you earn that badge, and in our explanation, you earn that shame, right? And you can't run away from it once it's already been done. And so why I say this is very important is because people, I think in general, they truly do underestimate the importance of roles, because women are put there to be with a certain amount of dignity, to control themselves. They do, to a certain point, control a little more of the narrative when it comes to social roles in our society. And the craziest part is, guys have to understand that they could stop it in the blink, in the snap of a finger, right, or the blink of an eye. All they would have to do is say, no, we're done with this. All these homosexuals, this is no longer allowed. All these OnlyFans pornography sites, kick them out, right? Trump could essentially go and sign a bill right now and say pornography is no longer allowed in America. Of course, half these pedophiles will probably lose their mind because this is what they thrive off of. But he just abolishes them, right? He gets rid of all these pornography sites and these X-rated sites, and just abolishes them and gets rid of them. And a lot of these problems would sort of eventually fix themselves. You would get to a point where, people wouldn't have access to this stuff. And of course, anybody that put enough energy enough, they could probably still get access to it in theory, but it could most certainly slow things down. And I bring this up because these roles are very, very important, and a lot of these things need to be understood. The fact that the men ultimately are the flag bearers, or I should say the sword bearers, right? They have the ability to make a difference. We as men are called to make a difference. There's a reason why God has entrusted us, specifically men, and I'm talking to you men right now when I say this, right? I'm talking to all of you men out there, whether you're 16 years old and you're just you're aspiring to be a man, or whether you're in your 40s or 50s. You're the men that God has called to be these men, these great leaders, right? We all, to a certain extent, have the capabilities of being good men. We have the capabilities of making a difference, influencing a lot of these decisions in our environment, in our society. But it's up to us. It's up to us as individuals. It's up to us to instill some of these values into our children. And I'm speaking to the dads now. All the fathers out there that have children, that have kids that are in their toddler ages or going into adolescence. I mean, both my boys right now, they're from ages as young as infancy, and I got a boy that's almost 8 years old. And I'll tell you something. Right now, he's finally starting to understand. He's finally starting to get it, where he understands that there are certain roles in life. He understands that there's a difference between mom and dad. He knows when dad says it, it better get done. He knows when mom says it, he has about 30 seconds until she tells dad. So the reality of it is even my boys understand this. They understand that the dynamic is, they understand that dad is not somebody to be messed with, and dad has a lot bigger of a role in a household environment than a mom does when it comes to discipline, when it comes to enforcement, when it comes to keeping people accountable, right? And we as men are also called to do the same. We're called to do this because we as men are called to hold our women accountable, hold our wives accountable, having those difficult conversations, talking to them in the time of chaos, reasoning with him after a big fight broke out. Because the reality of it is it's not that they're not listening. It's not like they're not thinking about it. And any woman that's even remotely Christian, or I should say, he has even a sense of wisdom, they will take a lot of what you're saying quite literally. Maybe not immediately, but with time they will. So I think a lot of you men out there, you underestimate the woman's ability to be able to understand, the woman's ability to be able to actually apply some of the stuff that the seeds that you apply in her life, right? And it's sometimes that you could say it, but you're real slow in action and you don't do nothing about it. And it's sort of like it's like hot air, right? And it's essentially, I'm pretty consistent with my discipline when it comes to my kids, right? So when I come up to my children and I say, do this or else, it's that or else literally means I will do it. It's not a matter of if I will do it, it's a matter of when I will do it, right? And I think with my kids, it's the fact that my consistency is probably the thing that they fear most, right? It's because, and this is how we're called to be consistent in our walk with God, right? God wants our consistency. I say this time and time again. where God doesn't care about our perfection. He cares about our consistency. He wants to see us walk in the light and to be the salt of the world, but he also wants us to be consistent, where there are going to be days where you're pissed off. There are going to be days where you don't have the energy, or you're sick, or something is going on, or there's some sort of hurdle or trial, tribulation you're going through, or you're not going to have the desire to sit down and, read the Bible or to pray or do anything else for that matter. But in those moments, you need God probably more than ever, because it's in the time of pitfalls. It's in the time of where we don't feel God is when we need him most, right? When we need him most in our life. And I think it's important for all fathers out there to understand that your families, your kids, your wives, that they depend on your leadership. They want you to go out and conquer the world for them. They want you to do that. They want you to carry their responsibilities and everything else on your shoulders, on your back. In other words, whatever they need in life, whether it's to pay for school or tuition, or to buy them those new sneakers. Like I was able to just take my boys to the mall the other day, and I bought them each a pair of Jordans, and I was sort of like talking and dwelling on it with them when I was growing up, that one of my life memories was when my dad used to take me to the store and buy me some, a fresh, we call them kicks. So a fresh pair of kicks, where I would enjoy them for a couple of days. And it was just like, I was in like cloud nine, right? Because it was the best thing in the world to have fresh shoes. And in California, for those people that lived in California, shoes are pretty much how people judged you, right? When you had a fresh pair of shoes, you were essentially the cool kid on the block. And I remember I spent a great deal of money and energy making the money to be able to afford to buy new shoes when I was, 8 years old, 9 years old, 10 years old. It was allowances that I worked very hard for, playing our, music and doing this and doing yard work, and then going to the neighbors, washing cars. And so when I talk about this, there's memories that could be made, right? There's a lot of these experiences where we create them with our children, right? And this is the same thing with our commitment with Christ, where we walk in these moments and we have to be consistent in them, because God is always, always, always watching, and he's always in our life, but we don't always choose to have God in our life, right? We don't always choose to be there for God. Well, God always will choose to be there for us, right? And it's important to realize that although I spent a lot of time talking about feminism, and there's a lot that could be said about this topic. I think this topic is like it's like the Grand Canyon. You could just keep tossing stuff in there, and there's always stuff that can be added to, right? And you can get down into the weeds here and talk about some of the additional roles that need to be displayed and stuff like that. I think ultimately what it comes down to, I wouldn't even blame the women. The women are, there's too many incentives for them, right? Essentially, you have all of these things that have been put in place to sort of create an opportunity for them to take advantage of, right? Whether it's the horrific divorce system that we have in place that is extremely favorable to the wife, right? Or the custody battle that dads can't see their own kids, and this only gets worse and worse in democratic states and cities where the boys can't, the kids can't even see their own dads, right? And essentially this sorts of sets up men to understand that there's a system that sort of has been built to work against them. And most men don't even want to get into relationships because of these things. And this is outside of all the other things that I've discussed. The women that go around and sleep around and do all these things and so forth. The being desensitized, to just pornography in general, and women and exploitation and stuff that we see in the world. And guys sort of feel that, why do I get married when I have, say, a computer or a VR, or right now we're headed into a world where there's going to be these sex robots that they'll perform anything you want it to perform. It's disgusting. We're headed into a world where a lot of these things are going to be more accessible. So the value of women will be exponentially declining as a lot of these other alternatives will be offered, right? And women have to understand that they're basically, how should I put this? Their desire to want to fight for the husband is already at its lowest, right? It's only going to get harder for women to keep guys happy, is what I'm trying to say, right? Right now, they're already at the bottom of the totem pole, like literally at the bottom, right? They already have to try so much harder to make sure that the guy is happy. Like, I talk to a lot of guys, and I have this conversation. I would say at least 70% of all my friends are still single. And they all range from ages of 25 to 45 to 50 even. And 70% of them are single. And most of them are not bad looking guys, and they got stuff going for them. They got good jobs. They're stable. They got businesses. They're really, they're very well rounded. Some of them are very, very educated. But meanwhile, they stay away from women. And I'll ask, a lot of them periodically, like, what's kept you away, or why don't you pull the trigger? Why don't you, put a ring on it, right? And they'll say the same thing. It's not worth it, right? And they've dealt with really toxic relationships where the woman will either, threaten them with this and that, and they're not even married yet, right? Or they'll go and cheat on their, I had a buddy where his wife cheated, his girlfriend cheated on him the first, year of their relationship. And he found out about it like in the 4th year relationship. And he's just like our entire relationship is a lie, right? And so now he was burned out by that, but then he's head over heels in love with her, but then he's conflicted, well, whether should I stay with her, should I not? So you have all these issues. Like, women are already they're losing this battle when it comes to a lot of these things, when it comes to keeping guys happy, when it comes to keeping guys sort of in their place. So really right now we're in a position where women need to step it up. Women need to step it up with their more importantly, women need to step it up with their discipline when it comes to being, clean until marriage, not sleeping around, when it comes to not being, a hoe or anything else. I think it's important for women to understand those are roles that are necessary. They're absolutely necessary for women right now. I think it's an important understanding that if you're gonna go into the dating pool with a head count of like 20, 30, 50, 100, nobody's going to want to marry you. There's a difference between wanting to date a girl and wanting to marry a girl, and that's the thing is and women out there they're extremely controversial. They're overly opinionated about everything. And let me tell you something, guys don't want that. Guys don't want an over opinionated, aggressive, abrasive, I'm just intelligent, I'm just showing my intelligence. No, you're not. You're really not. You're showing your dismissiveness. You're showing your combativeness, just your inability to work in sync. You're showing all these toxic traits that most guys will run for the hills for. And you don't want that anyways. And then what ends up happening when you do land that guy, he doesn't leave the basement. He doesn't leave the bar. He doesn't leave his job. He stays away from you. He literally travels to the furthest places of the world to get away from you because you're intolerable, right? He can't stand you, right? You want to make sure that if you are, trying to get a spouse, you're genuine, you're honest, you try to be organic, but you got to hold yourself in control, right? We all are called to control ourselves, right? We shouldn't let ourselves loose when it comes to our opinions or there or that, and men are also, they're at fault here when it comes to a lot of these things. I'm not trying to dismiss and point all fault to women. Men have to step it up. There are a lot of guys out there that don't put enough effort in this, but I think if men are to blame for anything, it's basically their unwillingness to deal with the conflicts, their unwillingness, or say their willingness to be more passive, right? Passiveness is probably one of the most toxic traits a man can have, right? And then another thing I'm going to tell men, this is specifically to men, is when you're dating that girl and you're going into a relationship with her and you essentially are in your lovey-dovey, honeymoon stage, don't compromise. A lot of you are going to want to compromise where you're like, oh, well, I love her so much and I don't want her to be upset with me, so I'm going to do this. I'm going to carry her on my shoulders and all this stuff. And I'm going to basically let her win every conversation, win every fight, do this, do that, buy her anything she wants, and just sort of spoil her, right? And unfortunately, just like a lot of dads make a mistake with their daughters where they do the same thing, a lot of husbands will do the same thing, right? And so the other thing I'll tell you is before you look into a relationship, look at the relationship between the daughter and specifically the dad, right? That's important. How is her relationship with her dad? That's very important. More importantly, how is the mom and what role does the mom take in the household? Is she the domineering kind of control freak that overpowers the house? Is she the one that makes the last say? Is the dad is sort of somebody in the background that doesn't make a peep? You know, is the woman the one that runs the household? Because if the woman is the one that runs the household, run. That is the absolute last thing you want. You never want to get into a relationship where the woman is controlling the household. You are going to be just sorely disappointed that, and for some of you men that think that it's something that can be overcome, or if you think, oh, well, she's not like that. She's like that. She's absolutely like that. And you are not going to make an exception to the rule here. The rule is she was raised in that environment. That's all she knows. And she's always going to ultimately turn back to that same response mechanism. She's always going to turn back to that same exact, well, that's what I was taught. That's how I grew up. That's what I understand. That's how my mom did it. That's how my dad did it. And it just gets exhausting. You start looking at it and you're like, well, you know, what should I have done then? Well, you should have ran. You should have ran because you had an opportunity, but you didn't take it. In other words, run away, right? And I can't stress this enough because a lot of you men out there will put yourselves in these toxic relationships. I have a lot of friends like this, very close ones too, for that matter, where they'll pick women that are in very, very, very domineering roles in their households, right? Their moms, so basically their mother-in-laws are just as toxic, if not worsely toxic than their own wives. And so a lot of that influence is coming from the tree, right? And the tree is the mother. You can't expect any woman to come out of that type of environment and that type of a household and to a certain extent not have those things at the threshold, weighing at them, right? You know, and if you think you're an exception to the rule and you're some sort of healer or therapist and you can make this person better, you're not going to. And what will probably end up happening is you're going to burn yourself out and you're just going to have to end up just dealing with it. You're going to have to end up dealing with it, and essentially there's just nothing you can do. And the only reason this works, and when I talk about feminism and roles in the relationship, this is really the only exception. If a woman has been raised in such a toxic environment where you know she's gotten away with everything because you know mother's in control and her dad doesn't do anything, and you know of course, like I said, look at the roles of you know the daughter and the dad. If the dad lets her do anything, if the dad has no control over her, if the dad has no say over her, you have no say over her either. If she doesn't listen to her dad, if she has no respect for her dad, if she starts spitting in her dad's face, you have no control over her, right? If she holds back and she holds her tongue to her dad, if she, you know, still shows him respect where respect is needed, even if her family is horrific, right? There are a lot of horrible families out there.